First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to our program tonight, The Ghosts of Beaverhead County. Without the support from our community, we would not be able to run so successfully. All of us here are volunteers, and all the money does go back into Beaverhead County Museum. The Beaverhead County Museum Association is always looking for members, financial help, support from the community. Our 75th anniversary is coming up next year in 2025, and if we work together with our efforts, our talents, and funds, the museum will last another 75 years. The rest of the year, we are going to have free programs every third Thursday of every month. November is going to be Louis Smithrow. It's 1930s black and white films where we can take a step back and see what it was like in the 30s in Dillon and surrounding areas. In December, in the main museum, we're going to be setting up old nativity sets that people can come look at during the night of the Christmas stroll. In January, we have Steve Morehouse that will give us a presentation on Lewis and Clark in the Beaverhead Valley. And my favorite in February is the author of the book, Pioneer Mountains, Montana's Hidden Gem, written by Leroy Farrell. If anybody's a hiker, they probably have that book, and he's coming to talk about it. Now, some of us believe in ghosts, and some of us just haven't had the experience to believe. Tonight, we are linking history to haunts using personal experiences along with stories from the past to try to find connections. We researched from newspapers.com, ancestry.com, the Beaverhead County History Books Volume 1 and 2, and we were able to find the connection needed for this show. On August 19th, she took our money today. She is a park ranger at Bannock State Park. And I had the privilege to go to Bannock under a full supermoon. I was really nervous for paranormal activity, being that it was a full moon in Bannock, Montana. But for some reason, to my surprise, it was calm when we went to the park. We parked at 9:45, walked down the empty streets of Bannock, taking plenty of photos. A couple bats definitely scared me in front of the jail cell. Other sounds, splashes, movements in trees, tiny feet shuffling caught my attention, but we debunked them as animals and birds. After touring the lower level of the mead, the three of us sat and told old stories of the town. I drifted away from the conversation. It was as if the streets came to life, and the dead were wondering what was being said about them in front of the old courthouse. Few by few, I felt the crowd expand. At one point, Lee even asked me if I was okay. I didn't want to ruin my otherworldly experience, so I didn't say anything. Shortly after, I stopped to take advantage of a photo opportunity using my night mode on my cell phone. Chris and Lee were ahead of me, and I felt something run behind me. And when I turned to see what it was, it ran behind me in the opposite direction. Of course, I was in front of the school, and it felt like a child was trying to play with me. But I wasn't scared. The only thing that scared me that night was Lee's driving. I'm just kidding, Lee. Thank you so much for driving us. I took this photo because I saw a figure with my naked eye standing under this eave, and if you have an imagination, you can see him. No one followed us home that night. We were all left with beautiful photos of Bannock, ghostly energy, history lessons, and above all, great company. Our Ghost Stories of Beaverhead County flyer holds Lee's most compelling photo of Bannock ghostly energy. Unfortunately, we didn't have any orbs show up on our photo shoot. After the presentation, we will do our drawing for our raffle and maybe ask if there's any ghost stories that anybody would like to tell. And join us for refreshments after in the depot foyer. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. But don't be scared. Don't be too scared.
Our beautiful county and one of its oldest cities, Dillon, has much history attached to them. And of course, along with its fascinating and varied history, we have a few ghost stories. Beaverhead County is a very diverse and interesting place to live and even to visit. The tales are being brought to you tonight by the trustee board of directors of the museum. We especially would like to thank two people who put this together, and they would be Morgan McLaren and Christy Pizzega of the Envy Salon. By the way, all of the stories we share are as they happened. None are made up. And that's a fact, trust me. Let us start off tonight with some real ghost stories from Bannock. Talking about ghosts in our county would be incomplete if we did not talk about Bannock. The first story took place at this cabin down on Bannock's East End. This is called the Renoir Cabin. This photo was taken August 20th, 2014 at 9:42 p.m. The next photo of the cabin was taken 1 minute later. And look, no orb. When I photographed the one with the orb in it, I could not see the orb as in this picture. Some people insist that orbs are spirits that perhaps have not made it to the other side yet. The Crow Indians also believe owls are spirits who have not made it to the other side yet. Other people say it's a reflective object, such as a bug, that the flash cannot photograph and cause to be seen. A good example of this is sometimes take a nighttime photograph of something outside when it is raining or snowing. You will see a lot of bright spots like orbs, and of course they are reflections off the moisture. So I don't think we're going to be able to tell tonight what an orb is for sure. There are many theories, but for now we will have to turn this over and our wonderful big question to William Shatner of the unexplained. The miner who owned this cabin was named Xavier Renoir, who was born March 31st of 1838 in Quebec. He moved west to Montana with his uncle after his mother died. He found the United States to be his home, and Xavier became a naturalized citizen October 17th, 1853 at the age of 15. He ultimately settled in Bannock about 1864. He himself built this little cabin on the east side of Bannock. You can see this cabin home now exactly in these photos. He seems to be one of the more picturesque places in the entire town. Xavier, like many people in Bannock at that time who were hoping to strike it rich, instead of mining, he made a living as a carpenter. His other endeavors included 2 years in business with his uncle in Bannock. Contracting, stock raising, and a little bit of mining. Like many of the miners in Bannock, he worked amazingly hard in all kinds of weather and ended up with very little to show for it. He was a bachelor, a lifelong and active Democrat, as well as an active member of the Bannock Masonic Lodge. He was an avid fiddle player and played at most of the community dances in Bannock. And we happen to have his fiddle in the artifacts collection of the museum. As Xavier got older, he started having ailments, as many older people do, such as running out of money and too proud to ask anyone for help. He was nearly 83 years old when he died, and the obituaries of our local papers say it best. Mr. Renoir had been ailing for quite some time. According to Coroner Brundage and his account, the unbearable pain in his head, as well as his dwindling financial situation, contributed to the unfortunate incident. Sometime in the afternoon of November 11th, 1920, he went to the neighbor's house and asked to borrow a shotgun with which to kill a rat. It got dark, and Xavier's neighbor noticed there was no lights coming from his cabin. He went to investigate and found Xavier Renoir sitting in his chair, dead, with a shotgun lying across his breast. Of course, his death has been attributed to a suicide. The following Saturday, his funeral service was conducted by Judge Ritalik, and graveside services were done by the Masonic Lodge. The interment was made in the Pioneer Cemetery. Moving on with ghost tales from Bannock. The next story is perhaps the best ghost story ever to haunt the campfire, Tales of Bannock. This will be the story of Dorothy Dunn, who drowned in Grasshopper Creek and whose ghost has been seen in the Mead Hotel wearing a flowing blue dress. The date is August 14th, 1915. It's a beautiful day at Bannock and typically hot for this time of year. Remember, this is a time where there are no cell phones or televisions, so the kids had to find something else to do to entertain themselves. On a hot day, what better than to get cooled off than going to the Grasshopper Creek and spending a hot afternoon swimming with relatives and friends in the welcome, cool water. This story centers around Dorothy Dunn. Dorothy is 15 years old and one of the best-liked kids in Bannock. She and several of her friends and brother Bill Dunn decided to cool off in an old dredge pond about a quarter of a mile west of Bannock. I took these photographs a couple of weeks ago from the road, so this is easily found up there. This was their famous swimming pool and favorite. When several of the girls got in and walked toward deeper water, they stepped off some kind of a shelf, whether it was part of the dredge boat or a rock, who knows. But anyway, neither one could swim. So a couple of the kids were really having a problem with the depth of the water. They were rescued by Bill Dunn. He looked around for his sister Dorothy and pulled her out of the creek. They tried to revive her, but it was too late. She had been under the water too long. She could not be revived. Bertie Matthews and Dorothy were the best of friends. Bertie's mother, Monty, was managing the Mead Hotel, and Bertie often helped her out. Bertie, of course, was distraught about the death of her best friend. One day, Monty asked her daughter to go upstairs in the hotel and get something for her. Bertie headed up the stairs, and when she got to the top, she stopped. She was one of the first people who saw the apparition of her best friend, Dorothy, and it really startled her. Dorothy was wearing her favorite dress, a fancy blue one with all kinds of frills. Bertie ran down the stairs, scared of course, and sheepishly told her mother of the encounter. Bertie never spoke of the incident again. She was a cousin of mine, as well as my godmother. Some of you, Mr. Davis here in the front row, I'm sure would know these people, Georgie and Bertie Matthews. Georgie Matthews was the Dean of Women up here for many, many years. In fact, the women's dormitory was named for her. So they had a pretty good legacy here in Montana. When I was in high school, my parents and cousin, Joe Ryburn, who was a teacher at the college, were asked to come over for coffee and homemade cinnamon rolls after church to Georgie and Bertie's house. We went inside and were seated in their parlor, which was overlooking out the front window with the college and canal for the view. Four of this group seated there were born and raised in Bannock, with the exception of my mother and myself. An hour or so had passed and it was time to go. And Dad said, one more thing. He said, Bertie, would you possibly tell Lee, meaning myself, your story, excuse me, about Dorothy and the blue dress in the Mead Hotel? Bertie, I swear, shivered and said something to the effect of, no, we don't talk about that. End of story. She never would. Except when I was writing about this incident, I made the mistake of Googling it. You cannot believe the different stories about the ghosts of Bannock, and especially of Dorothy. No wonder they're skeptics.
In 1901, a general mercantile owner by the name of Emerson Hill built a two-story frame house in Red Rock, Montana. The home had 8 rooms plus bathrooms and clothes closets. All of the wood furnishings were made of polished oak. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs on the upper floor, and in the attic there was a large water tank that piped to all the rooms of the house for use. The kitchen was annexed from the rest of the house. The lower level had a parlor, 1 bedroom, and a dining area. Frank Sealander was the contractor for the build, costing just over $4,000. Emerson Hill's mercantile store closed in Red Rock and moved to Armstead, where he teamed up with Gilster. Most businesses in Red Rock moved to Armstead when the train depot was built there for the Gilmore and Pittsburgh Railroad. Emerson Hill was active in Montana state legislation, and later he became a judge in Salmon, Idaho, leaving Montana in 1907. Mr. Hill and his wife Margaret had 3 children, John, Charles, and Maud. John married a girl from Idaho, bringing her back to Beaverhead County to live, while Maud married a man from Salmon and stayed there in that city after following her parents to Idaho. An unfortunate event happened to Charles in May of 1911. Charles and an intimate friend of his, Fred Dahlman, entered the Reinhardt and White warehouse where Dahlman was employed. While digging through the drawer, Fred found a .38 caliber Harrington and Richardson revolver. The firearm accidentally discharged, striking Charles, who was standing just 10 feet away, on his left side just below the heart, severing his arteries. He lived 20 minutes, proclaiming to anybody that had heard him that it was accidental of his friend. Honorable Emerson Hill came to Armstead from Salmon as soon as he heard the news. Although heartbroken, he expressed his sympathy to Fred. The Dillon Tribune read, Charles, or Chaz, as he was familiarly known by his friends, was natural born to Beaverhead County and would have been 30 in November. Almost all of his life he spent in the vicinity of Red Rock, except for his time away in school. He was one of the best known and beloved young men of this county, generous always, big heart, and true to the core. Chaz Hill was loved by all who knew him. In 1938, Ted and Ella Renfro bought the Emerson Hill Ranch, and it remained in the family until 1979. I do believe that a descendant of the Renfro owns it again today. Ella and Ted had 3 children, Alta, Ted Jr., and Joe. While Ted was a well-known trap shooter, winning a bunch of live bird championships, Ella ran a bus service to Red Rock, from Red Rock to Armstead. Ella ended up bedridden the last 18 years of her life due to rheumatoid arthritis. She passed in 1963 at Barracks Hospital, and Ted at his home in 1964 at his ranch. In the early 2000s, the Renfro house was a rental. A mother of 2 children rented the house for a year or so. The mother was employed at the Buffalo Lodge, and the kids attended the school at nearby Lima. The single mom loved the house, mostly its charm, telling me that the staircase and the woodwork were absolutely beautiful. She enjoyed the energy that the house had. She would also dream of angels in that house, and it would comfort her. The children seemed to like the house. There was plenty of room to spread out and get some privacy. The youngest was in middle school. During their stay in the house, they would experience dizziness, nauseousness, and extreme exhaustion in their upstairs room. It even got bad enough that they had to run tests to see if there was something wrong with them. They explained the symptoms to the doctor, and it sounded like carbon monoxide poisoning. The house and the room were checked, and the results came back clear. The siblings were now convinced that it was a ghost. When these two sat down and told me this story 10 years later, I had never heard of the Renfro House or Emerson Hill, so I did my research. I about hit the floor when I read of Emerson Hill's son's accidental tragic death, being that the siblings had told me that etched behind the closed door of the room that the youngest slept read, "The name of the ghost is Chaz."
Constructed in 1897, the Metland Hotel stands an impressive 60 feet wide and 115 feet long. Composed of a stone foundation and approximately 500,000 bricks, the Metland's 32,000 square feet is encased in 18-inch thick walls. In an article published in the Journal Tribune on the construction of the Metland in April of 1897, reads, "In a conversation with Mr. Metland this morning, a Tribune representative learned that the hotel will cost about $20,000. Will be built of brick and on a splendid rock foundation. Will consist of a high and roomy basement and 2 stories. It will be heated by steam, lighted by electric lights, will have a perfect sewage system, and all modern hotel conveniences. In the basement will be a heating plant, laundry, storerooms, rooms for servants. The first floor will contain an office, bar, sample room, lobby, barber shop, dining room, and kitchen. The second floor will contain the ladies' parlor and at least 30 bedrooms. The Metland would be furnished with some of the best woodwork available at its time, including the ornate railing going up to the upper floors having been shipped originally from Wales. Today, the Metland sits just west of where we are tonight, serving the many passengers who arrive to this very train depot. She would go on to be a gathering place for the community. Many events and various organizations would use its parlors and cafe as a place to host their meetings. Even the many ladies groups from local churches would meet here for their luncheons. Before he constructed the Metland, Joseph C. Metland left home at the age of 19 from Illinois, crossed the plains to California, where he would try his luck making his fortune from mining and various other vocations. This would be a mix of success and failure. Then, in 1867, while catching a ride on a freight wagon, a fellow passenger inquired about his missing finger. This passenger would turn out to be his brother Dave, who Joseph had not seen since he had left home. Joseph accompanied Dave back to Bannock, where he had been employed as a freight wagon driver. The two would establish a ranch in the horse prairie for a number of years before Joseph would dissolve his partnership and pursue a life in public offices. First as a representative in the territorial legislature in Virginia City. He would then move to Glendale with his wife and daughter until about 1883, when he relocated to Dillon and worked as county treasurer. He would purchase the Corinne Hotel in 1884, acting as its proprietor until it burned down 8 years later. By April of 1897, Joseph had his plans in motion for a brand new hotel to be built on the former location. The Metland Hotel, as he would name it, would open its doors in December of that year. Joseph would pass away at 5 a.m., December 17, 1906, at the hotel after a year of battling kidney cancer. His wife and daughter would continue to run the hotel until their own passings. His wife Janine in 1913, followed by their daughter Bertie in 1917. Joseph would be one of the many deaths to occur in the Metland's long 137 years of use. Some would be known individuals from the community, others would only find themselves needing a place to stay as they passed through. One such death was that of Douglas the Judge Galbraith. Although he was never actually a judge, he was a pioneer to the county and had lived many years in Glendale. He was also well known for the large number of horses he raised in the horse prairie. He had been a good associate of J.C. Metland's and had lived in the hotel for several years before his death. He passed in 1908 after lingering illness. Another was that of A.B. Martin, who was the pastor of the Presbyterian Church. He would suffer from a sudden stroke while visiting the parlors at the Metland. Charles Ford was another who found his time up at the Metland. Employed at the time as a dishwasher at the hotel, Charles spent a week in Butte prior to his death, most likely heavily drinking. He returned to town ill. He would pass a few days later in 1923. Although death is not a predictable event for any, one death at the Metland that occurred was very unexpected. Charles Sassman was a veteran police officer, having served several years as Dillon's chief of police. He would seek refuge in the Metland from a fierce blizzard before suffering a major heart attack. He died suddenly in the lobby. It was 1925. Although I'm sure more than one had taken place at the hotel, the next would be arguably the only recorded suicide to have happened. His name was Everett Pearson. He was a World War II veteran employed at Pfizer at the time, while living at the hotel. Pearson would take his own life, cause of death, self-inflicted gunshot wound to the abdomen. The year was 1976. Last would be that of Dorothy Alley. Dorothy and her mother purchased the Metland in 1979. Her family would continue to run it for 30 plus years. Dorothy would pass away in her room on the main floor of the hotel after an extended illness in 1991. She was 63. These are only a portion of the deaths recorded to have taken place at the Metland. With its long history, it was no wonder why many feel the Metland is haunted. Those who have had experiences there all share some similarities to what they have experienced. Male voices, smell of cigar smoke, items suddenly vanishing and having been moved. Feelings of uneasiness within certain areas. This had led to its share of paranormal investigations over the years, from local groups and hobbyists to the famed crew from the Ghost Adventures TV show. During the investigation done by the Ghost Adventures, they experienced a wide variety of paranormal encounters, including poltergeist-like activity, multiple responses through the equipment, one of them involving the most clear EVPs they had recorded at the time. This was captured after their sit-down with the manager at the time, Philly. Philly told them a story about the last days before Dorothy had passed. She was a close family friend and had requested that if Dorothy could, to give her a sign from the other side. Days after her passing in Dorothy's room, a glass would slide off of the table and break in midair. This EVP was recorded just moments after the interview, which had taken place in Dorothy's room. Many of the reports, mainly from staff, have worked there include lights turning off and on their own, items being moved when no one else is in the room, glimpses of cowboys and women in period clothing in the back bar, voices in empty rooms, and loud unexplained noises. Many of these reports overlap with those shared by others. Oftentimes, they would have no clue of what others had experienced. The most known ghost at the Metland would be that of a lady dressed all in white, usually by the dance floor, near where the main bar area is today. One such sighting of the woman in white was by a former manager in the 90s. As she was closing up one evening, putting stools up and wiping things down, she noticed and saw a glimpse of a woman by the end of the bar, very near the dance floor, all in white. She remembers feeling as though the woman was almost hiding her face. She looked away for a split second, and when she looked back up, the lady had vanished. While the Metland may not be one of the most famous haunts in our state, it is no doubt that the building has had its happy and sad events. Whether these events have led to the many paranormal reports, that is for you to decide.
born and raised, no, let her do this.
I was born and raised in Dillon a day or two ago, and I feel fortunate because Dillon's got a neat history. The people are great, and we have such a beautiful area. I left for a few years. What? Somebody agreed, I could tell. When I moved back to Dillon about 12 years ago, I got a job at the Dillon Bar for a short time. We had a good clientele, just like some of the neighborhood bars you see in the movies, but seldomly in real life. It was a quiet night, and two ladies, a mother and a daughter, walked in and sat down and ordered their favorite, Bud Light on tap. I brought them their pints and heard the younger one say to the older woman that where she lived was haunted. Well, I knew the house well. My parents and sister and I lived in it for several years. I told her my connection with the house and how did she know it was haunted. She told me that she can feel his presence, has heard him, and has even seen him several times. She even said she could recognize him in a picture. Well, this would have been the husband of my grandmother, who remarried after my grandfather was killed in 1956. They both moved into this house after it was purchased. I asked my sister Karen if she happened to have a picture of Pete. She loaned me one and was intrigued with the story. The ghost observer came in the next night looking for her beer, and I showed her the photograph of Pete and a couple of others. And she said, "Oh my God, that's him," and pointed out Pete. What more is there to say?
Oops. In 1888, the Oddfellows built a building on the corner of Bannock and Idaho Street. Their fraternity would meet upstairs across from the Masonic Hall facing each other on the prime corner lots of Dillon. The street level of the IOOF building was occupied first by the Dillon Tribune and then later by the State Bank. Within a year, the other Oddfellow members built brick structures next to the hall. Stringham and Gardner took up the middle of the block. Today, the original builders' names are no longer on either building. Stringham had his name above the building on the rooftop. Gardner's name was arched in the building's front facade, along with the date 1889. L.E. Stringham was an active Oddfellow Lodge member. His building was used for grocery and produce. Less than a year after opening, his 4-month-old son, Ralph Dillon, passed away. He closed his doors and moved back to his home state of California with his young wife. In 1891, he returned to Dillon. His friend, Christopher Beaverhead, expressed his concern for Mr. Stringham, saying he was not thinking clearly. Michael Rooney found Louis Stringham on September 21st, 1891, hanging from the rafters of the old Dillon Implement Warehouse by the railroad tracks. Death certificate reads, "Death by strangulation. Self, man was temporarily insane upon the time of his death. Stringham is buried next to his son in Mountain View Cemetery." J.R. Gardner built his grand building in the center of the block. The block was even referred to as the Gardner Block in Dillon's early days. James Gardner was listed as a merchant and a lodging house owner. He passed away just a year after his building was complete and buried at Mountain View Cemetery. Years later, Frank Ungst bought the building and he chiseled away Gardner's name and replaced it with his. Ungst ran the Eagle Bar out of this building. He also started the State Bar and the Mirror Bar, all three opening just after Prohibition was lifted. He was very generous with his money, donated to a lot of sporting clubs in Dillon, including the high school and the college. But Frank was also known to be quite the gambler. In 1941, he sold his building to Mountjoy and moved to Livingston to run the State Gardens, a similar establishment like the Eagle. And in 1949, Ungst passed away in Carson City, Nevada, in his hotel room where he had been running a tavern with gambling. His cause of death was accidental overdose of sleeping pills and alcohol. Mountjoy ran the Eagle Bar for a couple of years until Glenn Lyons purchased the establishment, eventually changing the name to the Octagon. In 2000, Don Cheney changed the name to Shooters. I had a really good friend that worked for Donnie at that time. She was young, 22, 23. She even ended up marrying him. They lived in the old lodging house remodeled into an apartment. It wasn't a happy marriage, and the divorce ended. They got a divorce a few years later. Years later, we were looking back at pictures of her when she was living and working in that building. She looked old and gaunt and wrinkles and frowning. She was so unhappy in those pictures. Today, she's 46 and looks 20 years younger than she did in her 20s, the time that she lived in that place. It was like the building aged her. Living and working in that location must have had something to do with it. After Shooters shut down, a lady bought the building and the liquor license was lost. Calamity Jane's was a unique clothing store. It offered Dylan a much needed store to buy women's apparel. Unfortunately, she didn't last long, maybe a couple of years. Freshwater Studios then occupied the space, and he only lasted a couple years, moving his studio to Butte. The building sat vacant for a couple years until a friend of mine opened his dream store in it. It featured beautiful art, blown glass, and apparel. The more time he spent there, I noticed his face changing. He looked gaunt, tired, the wrinkles started to show. One day, a lady even pulled up to the front of his building, walked in. He greeted her as he always did and asked if there was something that he could do for her, and she said, "No, I didn't come in to shop. I came in to tell you that there is a 7-foot entity standing behind you." It was as if she was warning him of the building's intentions. After he moved out of the building, his wrinkles diminished and his color came back, and today he looks younger than he did when he spent that time in that location. There's been several businesses that have come and gone since he closed his doors. I have not been in that building since 2016, and I really don't plan on it. The building next to the Oddfellow Hall was first ran as a saloon and lodging house by a duo, Estes and Schur. James Estes sold the building to Geo Koonsman in 1903. George remodeled the establishment into Dillon's finest saloon and lodging house. He even tore out the old bowling alley that was in the back during the remodel. He also purchased a cabinet from Estes for $400 for him to display in his saloon. The shelves house copies of newspapers from the past, including the New York Herald, April 15, 1865, the assassination of President Abe Lincoln. Another paper from the Vicksburg Star, printed in May of 1863, the fall of Vicksburg on the headlines. A plain piece of pine wood labeled as coming from the scaffold of which Henry Plummer was hanged. Yet another relic of Plummer's was an old breech-loading rifle that was dug up on Plummer's property after the noted outlaw was hung. The gun was a Sharpie of the carbine pattern, which was invented in the Civil War. There was also a piece of rope used for a lynching in Dillon's early days. The bones from Tom Jones from Ziegler Hot Springs, he had died there and they had his funeral, and after they found his bones, they displayed them in the cabinet. Bones from a man found dead on the Salmon River. They said it could belong to a prospector or fur trader of the time of Lewis and Clark. There was a variety of native Beaverhead County snakes in jars, a bow and a quiver of arrows that was taken from an Indian grave, a jawbone of a shark, the first set of billiard balls to be brought to Montana labeled Bannock 1863, a Japanese pipe, an opium pipe, petrified wood, arrowheads, and a $50 Confederate bill. There was a mineral line from from every mine in Beaverhead County, including gold, tellurium, copper, galena, lead, silver, agates, marble, pumice stone from Alder, jasper from Sweetwater, pipestone from the Red Rock, crystals from Crystal Hill in the Elkhorn district, and tourmaline, a mineral found in the hills just east of Dillon. The cabinet also had many animals, including birds, beautiful taxidermy of an animal that had the appearance of a muskrat with a furry body and webbed feet. No doubt the cabinet had many strange and somewhat disturbing articles. Years later, this building changes names to the Mint. The Mint Bar. Upstairs were furnished rooms called the Mint Rooms. Everybody knows that Dillon had many houses of prostitution, and the Mint Rooms were one of them. Have you guys ever heard about the madame that haunts the basement of the Klondike by the old coal chute? Well, I've heard of her. And I've also heard that people get funny feelings when they're downstairs, maybe by the old women's restroom. Workers in the past have a very hard time going downstairs, saying that it's very spooky. Shadow figures have been seen by the coal chute. It is said that she died after trying to abort a baby. Back then, opium was used for that process, but when too much was used, it was fatal for both the mother and the fetus. I have looked, but I can't find any proof of this, but I did run across Miss Ava Colette's sad story. It's July 1927. Harvey Trox, a local barber, at the pool hall, and Ava Colette, proprietress of the Mint Room Apartments, ventured to Birch Creek to shoot some gophers. Harvey drove up the canyon a short ways and got out of his car. 50 feet away, he tripped and accidentally shot himself with a revolver. Ava ran to the nearest ranch to phone for help, but Trox was dead on scene. 2 days after his death, Eva and her friend, Miss Pearl Reed, drove to the location where Trox was killed. Ava asked Pearl to leave her alone as she walked up the road. Nervous, Pearl went to the same ranch, owned by Blanche Stanfield, and sought help. They found her unconscious and brought her back to town, where she could get medical attention. She recovered a few days later. She had drank Lysol to end her life because of her boyfriend's tragic death. It wasn't the first time she drank Lysol, because in 1925, witnesses saw her drink a lethal dose, supposedly mistaking it for cough syrup. And Miss Ava Colette died on April 4th, 1928, at the age of 30 from uremia in her Mint Room Apartments. In 1941, a fire smoldered in the basement of the Mint Bar, owned by Glenn Lyon, just 2 days after he purchased the building. The building sat vacant for a year before that day. The building eventually caught fire, gutting the basement and street level. Some damage was done to the second floor furnished rooms. The roof and walls were intact. The State Bank to the east and the Eagle Bar to the west were protected from the flames because of their brick structures. Mild smoke and water damage were reported. That building was later named as Beck's Bar, and then later the Bannock House. The Bannock House was there when I was a kid. Buck Loomis ran the establishment with an Italian ambiance. They had the best fried chicken and spaghetti. Buck was always dressed to be a bartender, white shirt, pants, towel over his arm, glasses hanging from the top of the bar, a place that I have never forgotten. When Loomis closed his doors and moved to Butte, the Klondike changed locations from the back of the Hartwig Theater in the mini mall to its current location. But let's not forget the last oddfellow to build on the block. Securing the alley lot was Frank DeFries. An active member of the Oddfellows, held positions in the courthouse as well. He ran his painting business out of the location. He was contracted for painting the high school and the Corinne Hotel. He doesn't last long, gets himself into trouble, divorces his wife, and moves back to Nantucket where he was born. The building is currently the office bar, but before that it was the R&R, and before that it was the buffet. There was an apartment upstairs for many years, and currently nobody resides above the bar. There have been many sightings and poltergeist activity in the present-day office bar. One girl specifically told me that she sees shadow figures by the women's bathroom, by the back door alley entrance. Another bartender from the past told me that liquor doors would open and shut on their own, having proof on security cameras. So there is the history of the block. There is a lot of dark stuff, it seems to be. I don't have any answers, but I'd imagine that the haunting of the Oddfellows block would have something to do with its history. Could it be Eva Collette that haunts the Klondike building in the basement? Maybe Gardner, Stringham, or Ungst in the middle of the block? Maybe the ghostly energy comes from the Kunzman place that they displayed all the relics. We may never know, but it's fun to find out. In the late 1800s, Montana had new mining towns popping up all over its mountainous landscape. Just past Melrose was Trapper Creek Drainage had 5 town sites: Glendale, Greenwood, Trapper City, Lion City, and Hecla. The whole operation was ran by Hecla Consolidation and Mining Company. In its 20-year run, it produced over $22 million in ore, precious metals, and gems. With mining comes money, money comes greed, and with greed usually comes a bad outcome. In February 1883, winter had set in on Lion Mountain and all of its mining operations, along with several towns surrounding it. At the base of Lion Mountain was Hecla Town Site. Not allowed in this town was the temptations of saloons and brothels ordered by the superintendent, Henry Nippenberg, to help miners have better morals. So everybody would meet in Lion City to recreate. Many people occupied the 2 saloons and brothels of Lion City on cold nights. Among those were Victor Davidson, a single miner in his 20s, just off work from the mines, meets a man, Chaz Morrell. Chaz, a nomad gambler, nobody seems to know who he is. The 2 proceed to Glendale on foot, both signing in at the Avery House for the night. The following day, Victor and Chaz were having drinks at a local saloon, and the bartender noticed that Chaz looked familiar, but the name didn't match the face. After a long day of drinking and gambling, Chaz convinced Victor to go with him to Maiden Rock, to Wonderlux, for women, gambling, alcohol, and song. Chaz was aware that Victor had over $1,000 on him, and they proceeded to walk their 8-mile destination. Upon arrival at Wonderlux, which is present-day Divide, Chaz pulls out a revolver and shoots Victor, but he doesn't stop at that. He then butchers the body and tries to burn him by the river. Chaz's feet were so cold due to the work that he had to do for his crematorium that he had no other option than to go back to Glendale for medical attention. Telling the doctors that he had walked to Lion City and back, and that his companion, Davidson, had gone on train to Butte. His feet were so badly frostbit that they had to amputate them at the ankle. The bartender, suspicious to the story, figures out that he was in fact in prison with this man, and his name was not Chaz, it was John Jesserang. A search party went out and found the remains of Victor Davidson in a pile of burnt willows. It was a gruesome sight on Lower Canyon Creek, where the creek meets the Big Hole River. Davidson's head was never found. The charred bones were then brought back to Glendale, where the townspeople lined up to see the horror. John Jesserang was arrested and brought back to Dillon, for it was the nearest county holding cell. It must have been a cold 40-mile ride back to Dillon on horseback without feet. About halfway sat a railroad tank near Darling, Montana. The tower was close to where Willow Creek flows into the Big Hole River, just a few miles south of present-day Glen. The deputies tried to get the truth out of Jesserang by stringing him up on a rope with his neck, but he wouldn't say a word. They locked him away in a holding cell in the back. They locked him away in a cell in the back of a building that housed a saloon up front. He then awaited his trial. John had been a butcher in Helena along with his brother George, natives to St. Paul, Minnesota. The boys came to Montana to open a butcher shop where gold mining was prosperous. The two found themselves in trouble, possibly John murdering a man for gold. His name was John Den, who happens to be one of Helena's oldest haunts. John Den owned a store that sold whiskey in the cellar in Last Chance Gulch. He was killed with a hammer-like weapon, having been stricken once in the back of the head and twice in the forehead. The vigilantes came to Helena and captured John Jesserang, brought him to the cellar where John Den's blood was still on the floor, and tried to get him to confess. But he wouldn't. This is noted as Helena's first 3777 warning. Never finding solid proof, he was set free and ended up in prison a year later for grand larceny, for stealing cattle. When he entered the prison, his description was 5'11", 165 pounds, light brown hair, blue eyes, hangdog face, and 2 upper teeth missing. He, however, snuck out of the prison, being Montana State Prison's first person to escape. A month later, he was found at Willis Station, brought back to Deer Lodge, and was pardoned. At that point, John didn't have anything to do, so he moved around from mining camp to mining camp until he ended up in Lion City on that wintry night. The terrible event that he performed on Davidson was only the start of the tragic events. Almost a month passed. The morning of March 4th, 1883, a band of masked vigilantes came to Dillon 2 by 2 from all directions. They drank in the saloons until just past midnight. They scaled the walls and stole the keys from the undersheriff watching over the prisoner. There would be no second chances for John Jesserang from the vigilantes. They drug John out of his cot and hung him by a rope on the jail beam and jerked him into eternity. The lynching only took about 20 minutes from start to finish. The vigilantes left him hanging with his bloody stump swinging just inches away from the floor. The men scattered, having saved Beaverhead County a lot of money for a trial now not needed. You know that piece of rope in Kunzman's cabinet? That was the rope used for John Jesserang's lynching. After the lynching, the Dillon Tribune read, the coroner buried his body in a potter's field adjoining Dillon. The jail sat on the southeast corner of Dillon in 1883. And then by 1906, Dillon had expanded. Where the log affair was where the Presbyterian Church Manse was built. There was sagebrush, as you can see, in the field just east of the city, where Dutch Flats were, now the East Side Addition, all the way to the college. In January 31st, 1885, 2 years after John was lynched, the newspaper read, "There is no question that all ghosts and ghost stories are humbugs, but some people will believe in any sort of humbug. Persons that delight in haunting ghosts will be pleased to learn that the ghastly-looking ghost of John Jesserang, the cremator, is to be seen these moonlit nights in the sagebrush southeast of town." So John haunts somewhere on the east side, from South Glendale Street to the college. Coroner Hirschman buried his remains in a casket in the Potter's Field just north of town, somewhere on Montana Street side of the railroad tracks, just north of the current laundromat. In 1888, some caskets were moved to the newly plotted Mountain View Cemetery, but several still remained until 1907. In 1907, road graders unearthed remains. The road graders at work on a sinkhole near Dillon Creamery continued to dig the remains of the dead that are buried here over a quarter century ago. There is no way of telling where a grave is. The headboard of the grave that once told where the departed slept, long since gone and decayed. When Mountain View Cemetery was plotted and the city started to use its burial ground, a number of bodies were moved from the old cemetery, but there were a dozen or more lost. These graves are the ones being unearthed by the graders. Several dogs and a hog were found as well. The coroner collected the remains and put them in 3 caskets and buried them in a potter's field in Mountain View Cemetery. John was either moved to the potter's field at Mountain View Cemetery in 1888, or he was graded with the rest of the corpses and thrown into some caskets together. Victor Davidson was buried at Poindexter Cemetery. In 2017, experts attempted to move him to the potter's field at Mountain View Cemetery along with other corpses, for a pivot needed to be used. But unfortunately, a marker was never found for him. The connection gets kind of weird with me. In 1901, a Presbyterian church was built on the site where he was lynched. In 1952, the man's was moved to the 900 block on Glendale Street. I grew up on that block. I bought a house on that block. My friends and I used to mess around with the Ouija board when we were kids, and we also thought it was cool to try to talk to spirits. So did we connect with the spirit of John Jesserang, being that the man's is on the same block, or is it just because we're on the east side, close to where he haunts? In September of 2019, Morgan and I set out for a hiking trail to a place that neither of us had ever been. Sitting at the head of Canyon Creek is Crescent and Abundance Lakes. There has been several times that I've been in the deep woods and felt uneasy or kind of felt a different vibe, and these high mountain lakes did just that. As we approached Abundance, I started to feel the change. When we arrived to our destination at Crescent, I started to panic. I was looking for a trail that didn't exist. I was getting angry. Morgan even noticed that I wasn't talking like I normally do, like maybe I was someone else. All I wanted to do was get out of there. We hiked 13.5 miles round trip that day to spend 5 minutes at our destination. After eating a quick lunch back at Abundance, we headed back to the truck. And when we came back to Dillon, we started researching and found the John Jesserang Victor Davidson story. I have searched for almost 5 years for answers of the whereabouts of John Jesserang's resting place and where he might haunt. I have my theories, but I have no proof. All I know is that John Jesserang is the oldest recorded haunting of Dillon.
Let's look at another couple of nighttime Bannock photos with orbs. This will be coming close to winding our program. They really don't have any ghost stories to go with them, but the nighttime photos are nice anyway. This is the Graves house in Bannock. This was the first frame house in Montana, they say, and it was built the year 1867/68, which means it was also made over the winter. My dad was born in this house in 1914, and my grandfather was born in this house in, I believe it was 1886. I don't know a thing, nobody that I know of died here or had any problems. But anyway, this is one of the orbs. And the next picture has an orb on the other side. So I don't know. Those orbs are fascinating. Okay, the next one is the Masonic Temple and School. To me, there's too many orbs here. This has to be reflection on something. I don't recall it raining that evening, but I don't know. I honestly don't think those are orbs that we should be concerned with. I think it's something in the photograph. And the last photograph is a photo of Skinner Saloon with an orb and another orb on the other side up against the Mead Hotel, but I think it's near the saloon here. This has seen a lot of action, killing, shootings, that type of thing. Henry Plummer killed a guy in there, Jack Cleveland. And also, there was a shootout between two gamblers, Sapp and Banfield were their names. Nobody was really hurt, except there was a little dog, Toodles, that was killed. That was the only, maybe that's the orbit of Toodles, I don't know. But anyway, this was raining this night, and I think that's one of the reasons the colors are so vibrant and shiny and all that good stuff. Where did,
She'll be right back.
okay, what do we do now?
Should we do this and then tell a couple ghosts?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, we will do the raffle for the basket, and then afterwards, if anybody has a 2-minute paranormal story, ghost story that they'd like to share, we can pass the microphone around. Remember, there is cookies and refreshments out in the foyer of the depot for everybody, so everybody get your tickets out.
The number, the last three numbers,
The last three numbers are 855. 855. Check mine.
Oh yeah, you can't win.
I know.
I got that easily.
855.